Bonjour, je m'appelle Gilles Gravier, je suis français. On m'a dit que si j'appuie on this button, it turns on automatic translation. Are we good? Good. Okay. So, Wipro is active globally, actually. It's an Indian company, but we're all over the planet, just to clear things up. What I do at Wipro is I do strategy consulting on open source, on blockchain as well. That's how I got involved in the Odyssey hackathons initially. Rutger called me and said, "We're doing a blockchain hackathon. You're a blockchain person. Do you want to come?" And I said, "Yes, but if I can talk about open source." Like, okay, I like that. So I'm here again. This is my third Odyssey hackathon, and I'll be present. By the way, anybody here going to the hackathon itself? Oh, good, okay. I'll be there as a Jedi to answer your questions on open source, which, once we've done this presentation, you should not have any. No, I'm joking. You should have much more. So I'll actually start by questions. This time, I'm going to be the one asking questions. There will be another question and answer slide at the end for you to ask questions, but as was said, this is supposed to be an interactive session, so feel free to interrupt me at any point in time if you have a question, a comment, if you want to challenge me on something that I'm saying, because the whole point of open source is, to challenge yourself and learn and do better things. But first of all, who here has already used open source? Who thinks they've used open source but aren't really sure? Okay, good. So you know you've used open source. Anybody not use open source? Good, okay. That's a joke. Okay, good. I mean, there's open source everywhere. Probably by listening to me, you're using open source somewhere. So who's actually contributed to an open source project? Pretty good. Who in their organization is actually using open source as a strategic tool to achieve some other goal than just coding? Okay, good. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about using open source. That's what I do with my customers, using open source to achieve strategic business goals. And in particular, today, we're going to be talking about growing your business, growing your projects through using communities in the open source world. A lot of my customers are actually doing that. They're asking me, how can we, first of all, create a community, and that's something complicated, and then make it interesting and active, and then use that to grow the company, to get market share, etc. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to first start by explaining a little bit why we do this, okay? That's for those of you who use open source without necessarily understanding or knowing all of the interesting and cool things that come out of using open source. When we talk to our customers and ask them, so why are you doing open source? They all start by saying, it was cheap. Okay, good. But are you still doing it because it's cheap? Well, actually, no. Sometimes it's not even as cheap as that because you have to pay for support, training, integration, all these things. So those are all the other benefits, the one that actually convince our customers to stay. Innovation. Oh. You can't see the laser on the screen, at least not from a diagonal. Anyway, so innovation, fail fast, code, break things, doesn't work, try something else, because you can just download the app anyway. Better software quality. Grow your teams, get people on board by telling them that you're doing open source and they love it. I've actually seen developers resign from a company because the internal policy doesn't allow them to contribute to a project, and join. The example I have in head is a Swiss company that lost a developer who wanted to contribute to Wikipedia, and he left a very highly paid job in Switzerland to join the Wikipedia Foundation. And the CIO came to me and said, what the hell just happened? He doesn't like money? Like, no, he likes coding for the right reasons, and money comes second, which you never tell that to your bosses, right? Don't. But in any case, we all understand that coding for the right reason is an absolutely great motivation. So if you want to attract talent, do open source and make it visible. And obviously improve competency because you train people and you train yourself by doing open source. So those are real benefits that our companies, our customers really see. So as you can see, some of them have an impact on on the people that you attract to the company. So I'll start first by talking a little bit about licenses. Why? Because in the open source world, one of the key aspects that governs how you use a software is an open source license. A license, for those of you who are not lawyers, is a unilateral sort of contract, except that in Europe it's not seen as a contract because it's not signed by both parties. It's something you agree as a user to adhere to if you're using the software. It basically starts by saying, if you're using my stuff, those are the rules. If you break those rules, you can get into trouble. And it's really interesting because a lot of people see in the open source world that a license is something that gives you permissions. That's the key thing people see. My open source license let me use this stuff for anything I want. But it also brings obligations to people who use your code if you're the one who wrote the code. Or it brings obligation to you if you're using the code in your own software. And that is really important. We'll see how that has an impact in terms of community building. That's why I'm talking a little bit about licenses. These are two, I think the slides will be made available. If they're not available, my email's on the last slide. Write it down, and then email me. I can send them to you. So that is really important. Have a look at these two websites. They'll help you pick a license. At the hackathon, come to me if you need help in figuring out what's the best license for your project. In particular, once you've heard what you can do with a license in terms of working with a community. So an open source license, what is it? It's a piece of text that says, this is what you may not do, this is what you have to do. There's an organization called the Open Source Initiative that looks at all of the licenses that claim to be open source or that would like to be recognized as open source and says, yep, nope, yep, no, and approves all of the various open source licenses. This is really important because companies sometimes feel they need to create their own license because they have something really specific to them that they feel would be better expressed if they use their own license. And they still want their software to be open source. And so they will submit their license to the Open Source Initiative, which will review the license and give a stamp of approval or not. If you want to do open source, make sure the license you are using is one of the approved licenses. I strongly recommend not to invent a new license. It's a very complex process. It requires lawyers. It very often takes a long time because you don't get it right the first time. In particular, a license, for example, cannot discriminate against field of endeavor. So you cannot have an open source license that says, with my software, you may not do this or that. Who here has not heard about CERN, the European Nuclear Research Agency? Okay, so in their charter, they have that the stuff being made at CERN cannot be used for war. They do everything open source. They decided to create their own license. And in their license, they put, you can use our stuff, except because it's at CERN, it's made at CERN, not for war. And then they submitted the license to the Open Source Initiative. And the Open Source Initiative says, nope, it's not an open source license because you cannot, in your license, limit field of endeavor. And that is really important. Even though it may be deeply something you believe in and you think it's the right thing to do, don't use it for war. Or you may have a stupid, I don't know, chauvinistic way of looking at things, like maybe the Chinese saying this license applies to everybody, but you cannot use it in Tibet. Doesn't work. Or some other strange criteria, it won't be approved. So what CERN actually did is they said, okay, we'll use the GPL license, which is a fairly standard license. But in the README, it says, by the way, if you use our stuff to do weapons, we won't help you. If you have questions, we won't answer. If you want to mention us anywhere, we won't. It's just, you can do whatever you want with it, but don't ask us if it's for war, okay? So they use a normal license now. They actually have one license they created for hardware, but for the software perspective, they use they use the GPL because it's so much easier to pick one that works well. And so we're going to look here at categories of licenses and how they impact multiple things, but in particular, how they impact your community. There are three categories of open source licenses. The first one is the non-reciprocal license. It's basically a license that says, here's the author, here's where the software comes from. Do what you want with it. No other obligation in general. And the most common one, the most known one is the BSD license. It basically has 3 clauses. It's really, really short. And it says, this is owned by or copyrighted by. Here's where it comes from, and do what you want with it. There's a guy who actually created a license, which I like a lot. It's called the Do What the Fuck You Want With It license. Look it up. And initially, when he created the license, he submitted to the open source initiative, hoping it would fit in one of those categories. And the OSI said, nope, sorry, because it's missing this. It's missing this clause because your license doesn't say that the copyright holder would be blah, blah, blah. So he reviewed it, he modified it a little bit. So there's now the version 1.1 of the WTF license, which contains a clause that fits the definition. And the FAQ is really simple. It says, question, may I use your license to do this? Answer, yes. Second question, may I use your license? Yes. Third question, yes. That's it. It's a do what the fuck you want with it license. Don't use that for your project. It's lacking a lot of other things that might be interesting. But that's an example of you can use my stuff for anything. Those are not really community fostering licenses because it's basically if you like my stuff and you want to be good with it, feel free. It works. The BSD community is a growing community, but it also encourages companies like maybe Apple to take BSD Unix, embed it into their operating system, and then make something that is completely proprietary on top of it, and not share any of their knowledge. And that kind of sucks. So if you want people to participate, probably pick another license, unless you're really sure that people will really participate in what you're doing. So the other category is the file level reciprocal, or weak copyleft. Copyleft is a term that was coined by the Free Software Foundation. The file level reciprocal. And basically in this category of license, it says, you may use my software for whatever you want, because open source, but if you fix something in my software, if you modify one of my files and maybe fix a bug, that modification must be contributed back to the society. So it must be made available. Doesn't mean you have to publish everything instantly, but there must be some place where people can get to the modification you've made. Okay? You can integrate with commercial software. You can build something completely commercial on top of it, all proprietary, whatever you want. But if you fix a bug in my stuff, the fix to that bug should be available for whoever you distribute the code to, and that includes me, because if I download it, you distribute it to me. Okay? So this is interesting because it grows a community around a specific piece of code. Okay? You encourage your users to actually make your software better. Okay? That's really important. But it allows people to actually build something proprietary on top of it. So if you pick one of these licenses, like the Mozilla license or the LGPL, you can link commercial proprietary code to an open source stuff. If you want to encourage companies that only have proprietary software to use your stuff, that works really well. The third category is the project level reciprocal, or the strong copyleft. That's the free software licenses like the GPL. The idea here is that you can use my stuff for anything you want, just like the other two. But if you fix something in my code, like this one, you have to make the fix open source. But even more, if you add something to my code, whether it's an additional function or a complete application on top of it, that application must be made open source as well. Okay? And their definition of adding is dependent on the license. GPL says dynamic linking is considered adding. LGPL actually says if you link dynamically with my code, you're protected. You can have proprietary software that links dynamically to my code, and it doesn't have to be open source. GPL says dynamic linking, it's connected, it has to be open source. This is interesting because it grows the community around your whole project, and not just around your code, but around the whole project. So because the idea here is to say, if you're using my stuff, your stuff must be open source so that everybody benefits from your stuff as well, including us. This is great when people tell me, you know, I'm publishing my code as open source, but I'm afraid that the competition will use my stuff and make something better. But if your stuff is open source with the GPL license, what your competition does must be open source as well. So you can take their code and integrate it into your code and make it better. Okay? So that's something that you want to think about, because with these licenses, you're going to be encouraging people to actually participate in a specific way to your community. Make my code better, should be open source. Add to my code, should be open source. Let me tell you a little bit of a horror story. How are we on time, actually? Okay. A little bit of a horror story. Anybody knows Linksys? The little blue routers with the 2 antennas on the back? Okay. So these were really popular in the 1990s, 2000, as the first Wi-Fi routers that were around there. And everybody bought these routers. They were cheap, they worked well. And one day somebody realized that inside the router was Linux. So not only they work well, but once people found out it was Linux, they asked Linksys, oh, Linux at the core. Linux is GPL. This means that everything on top of that Linux in that box, because a box is considered a single project, bundled per the GPL, everything in that box must be open source. Please give us the source code. Linksys said no. Went to the lawyers. Linksys said, all right. So they did the right thing after some time, and they published the source code. If you go to gpl.linksys.com, they have a whole website where for each router that has GPL code inside, they publish the whole source code. That's really good. Took them some time and some, I was going to say convincing, coercing, but they did it, okay? Now, this is where it really gets tricky, because when they started publishing all of their source code, somebody from Broadcom, the chipsets for Wi-Fi were Broadcom chipsets, came to them and said, wait, you just published our drivers here. They're not open source. You don't have the right to publish our source code. Please take it away. So Linksys said, all right. So they started negotiating with Broadcom. They got into an agreement. The source code is published. Broadcom made the drivers open source for Linksys. Fine, open source, period. Fine. Okay, so people started looking at the source code and making their own custom firmware, including companies like FON. Anybody not know FON Networks? Yeah, okay. It's a Spanish company, I think, originally. And the idea was that if you had a router that was a FON router, basically a Linksys with custom firmware, and you shared your bandwidth, then you had free access to any other FON router. So it created a community of people sharing their bandwidth. They're still active. In French, if you're an SFR customer, that automatically makes you and you share your bandwidth, which all SFR routers do. It automatically makes you a FON user, and you can connect to any FON router on the planet and use their Wi-Fi, which is really cool. Nowadays, there's Wi-Fi everywhere, but back in the 90s and 2000, Wi-Fi, scarce. So a lot of people started using this stuff. Really cool. Now, this is where the hackers come in play. You guys who really look at the source code and figure out what's in there and realize suddenly that, wait, in the Broadcom firmware, I can actually, in software, change the transmission power of my Wi-Fi chipset from 42 milliwatts, that's the law in Europe, for the 2.4 gigahertz, to 200 milliwatts. That's really cool, because if you increase the range of the router, to beyond my house or beyond my apartment, that was really fun. And it made them even more popular, because then the first thing people did is get their custom firmware, tweak the transmission power, and cool the transistors with bigger radiators, and it worked well. Until the telecom regulation authorities of France and a few other European countries came to Linksys and said, wait, your routers are too easy to hack so that they go beyond the regulatory specs, so we can't let you sell the routers anymore in Europe. Bummer, because they were really popular. So a lot of people were buying these routers. So Linksys went back to the drawing board and created a new version. So the WRT54G had version 1, 2, 3, 4 based on Linksys, on Linux. Version 5 came out with a VxWorks microkernel, which was not open source. And that solved the problem. And VxWorks is smaller memory footprint, so it required a smaller CPU, less memory. The routers were even cheaper. So cool. Except now, nobody could hack them, because the source code wasn't available. So people at FON Network started screaming at Linksys, saying, wait, what do we do? You're cutting us, the branch we're sitting on, and we're not happy about that. So Linksys thought again and said, OK, we're going to make another line of routers, the WRT54GL for Linux, that is the same as the older 54Gs, but with Linux. But we're going to make it a little bit more expensive so that the normal person on the shop buys the cheap one, doesn't hack into it, and only the dedicated hackers, which you will never stop anyway, or the OEMs will buy the more expensive ones. And that sort of kept the telecom regulation authorities happy until now. What happens is actually the firmware lets you set the power, the transmission power, but the chip limits it anyway, so you can't really do anything bad. But at that time, they had to do a new version with Linux, which also was popular. So this is an example of how a license, which was chosen by the Linux guys, Linus Torvalds and everything, and the whole community, had an impact on a company that didn't really read the license terms, an impact that forced them to publish their source code, they hadn't planned, somebody else's source code, oops, get into big legal trouble, lots of financial things, agreements, licenses to publish source code, had to change their product line twice, and so be really careful. If you're going to be integrating open source code, read the licenses, make sure that what you're going to be using your code, that code for within your code is compatible with the license of the modules you're using. And when you're publishing your source code, make sure you select the license right based on what you expect the downstream people, those who will use your code, to actually do with your software, right? You can encourage them to contribute. You can force them to contribute updates to your code. You can force them to make all of their stuff open source if you select the license right. But people who use your code will also see that. And some people, for example, have a corporate policy to not use AGPL licensed software. There's a cigarette vendor in Switzerland that I'm not going to name. There's 3 of them, so pick one. That has this policy to not use MongoDB internally, the open source version, because the license, which was initially the AGPL, that's an open source license here, and now has a new license called the server-side public license, which didn't pass the open source test. It's not seen as open source anymore, too restrictive. But basically this license says, if you use my stuff as a web service, so even if nobody's downloading your software that uses my stuff, the fact that they are accessing it through the web means your source code must be accessible to them as well. So AGPL says, as a service is also considered distribution to people. And so that cigarette company is really worried that by using this kind of code, maybe putting MongoDB on a server that's on the internet, suddenly all of the code that's attached to it, including their internal databases and proprietary stuff and algorithms, etc., will have to be made open source. They're terrified about this, so they've just decided no MongoDB, no touchy. Okay, so be careful when you choose your license, because it might impact negatively in addition to having the positive impact you're looking at. All right? Okay. By the way, this is the CERN hardware license. It's called EasyFi. That's the project they use. That's the license, open hardware license. So if you're looking for during the hackathon, you're looking for a hardware open source license, that's a very good candidate. It's basically they took the GPL and they adapted it to hardware. They didn't put any CERN stuff in it. It's just the GPL hardware thing. Okay, so yeah, I talk a lot, by the way, and
that's why I'm interested.
can I breathe?
I wanted it to be interactive. So any questions there? I see some questions in the back. Let's take 1 or 2 questions in between.
So I'll leave this back up.
I was just wondering your thoughts on the new license that was put through recently enough, I believe, called the Cryptographic Autonomy License.
I haven't heard about it, so I don't know.
Fair enough.
So I have no point of view on it.
Yeah, and a bit similar question. I was pretty intrigued about the copy-fair kind of licensing.
The what?
Copy-fair licensing, which is coming from, let's say, peer-to-peer commons book or philosophy. So if you're familiar with that.
Okay. So first of all, to follow up on I don't know that the crypto license you're mentioning, there's about 2,000 licenses that qualify, that are used out there, and several hundreds that match the open source criteria. So there's a lot of licenses, right? And honestly, that's already enough. New licenses, unless they cover a specific aspect, are not really required. From the Creative Commons, so Creative Commons is an organization that really aims at protecting more like creations, not software itself, but more like text, images, works of arts, with a very wide definition of works of art. So if you write the documentation of a software, it would use a Creative Commons license that says you can distribute it, you can actually copy my stuff and reuse it in your own, you can use it commercially or not, the CC by attribution, commercial, lookalike, etc. So they usually don't apply to software because software is specific to, has this specific aspect that you can actually not only read the code, so it would be seen as free speech, as a book, it's something like that, but you can execute the code. Unlike a book, like a novel or a piece of art, which you don't usually, again, sometimes now with the more modern artists out there, you don't really execute a piece of art, you just enjoy its existence and you might want to make copies, photos of it. So, so that's the thing with Creative Commons and the comment I have. Again, specific licenses are derived from it, I would usually see as applying to this as for artistic type of creations. It's tricky in some cases because for those of you who have gray hair like myself and remember the times around 1998 when cryptography was controlled all over the planet, the way the PGP team managed to export PGP outside of the US, they basically said, okay, we can't export encryption software because that's a weapon, but we can print the source code on a paper book, and that's free speech. So they printed 600 pages of source code. Creative Commons wasn't there at the time, by the way, so they just said it's copyrighted material, but it's free speech. They posted it to Finland from the US, and that was allowed because it's a book, free speech, blah, blah, blah. And in Finland, they scanned the page, OCR'd everything, corrected the bugs and things like that, 600 freaking pages of code, and created PGPI, the entity that published PGP International. So, in general, printed material should be covered by Creative Commons types of licenses, but in some cases, it actually is code that ends up being executable after some time. At the time, there was a T-shirt that had a barcode version of the RSA encryption algorithm written in Perl. So the text in Perl was free speech. The barcode was machine-readable and executable code. So when you walked around, you could be seen as a munition from various legislations. Actually had the legislation text in the back that said, by the way, in France, it's a category 2 munition, so don't talk to a cop while wearing the shirt. But so, yeah, sorry, I digress. Any other questions before I talk too much more? Okay, good. So now let's talk of some of the benefits of open source as they apply to communities. So the first one that's really interesting in terms of community is that when there's a good community on your code, maybe I'll take one step before. People talk about communities, especially in the open source world, as if it was something that was clearly identified, clearly defined, and more importantly, manageable and controllable. The most common thing I hear from companies who are going to use open source is, for support, oh yeah, I'll use the community. I'll send them an email and they'll respond. Yeah, that works. I've seen actually a company, I'm not going to name them, but they're a big US bank that said, we don't understand. We sent a support request to the open source community of, I don't know, Cassandra or something like that, asking them for a service level agreement. How fast would they respond? And nobody responded to us. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. So communities, you can't really control a community and work with them the way you expect to work with a commercial organization that has SLAs, contracts, and things like that. That said, once you understand the fuzziness of a community and you can attract a community to your project, there's some really cool things you can do about it. The only thing that's hard is making that community interested in your project. Why? Because if your project is boring in itself, and I'm not saying what you're going to do is boring, but if your project is boring and only you see an interest in it, you're never going to get a community around your project. A community is a bunch of people who are interested in what you're doing because it makes sense to them, not to you, and because of that, they will invest some of their time into making this stuff better for them, not for you, okay? Remember that. Communities are selfish people, all working to make something good and better for them. Some of these people really have a community-oriented group and will do something for the community, but most of the time, they don't have the time to do things for the others, unless they're paid by their employers to do so. So they do it because the motivation is theirs. They want to build a better CV, they want to grow their skills. Contributing to an open source project is an amazing way to have your code reviewed by the best programmers on the planet, you know? So if you want somebody to make constructive and very educational comments on your code, contribute to an open source project, because the committers there are going to look at your stuff and say, you know, you could write it this way, rewrite it that way, this is boring, this doesn't fit our roadmap anyway. And it's a great way to learn and get better, okay? But that said, make sure that you understand that a community is not something you control. You may put all the tools out there, communication tools, great, you know, documentation on how to interact. If people don't want to because they're not interested, they won't. And their tools, actually, I'm going to mention that a little later, but they're tools to encourage people to contribute to your code. But while you use these tools to do so, people contribute. The moment you stop using them, unless there is that community interest of people who think your stuff makes sense for them, they will stop as well, okay? That said, if you're working with a community that is active and dynamic, some things happen. First of all, they're really cool because the people in the community are going to be your best advocates. They're going to talk about this stuff. Why? Not because you're telling them to, but because they love the stuff, or else they wouldn't be participating in the community, they wouldn't be using it. So because they love the stuff, they're going to talk about it between themselves. They're going to talk about it to other people who might not be using the software, the product, the whatever, and convince people. So you get an amazing way of, you know, leveraging the community to actually grow the reach of your project. You attract people that way. And to do so, this is the most important thing, make sure that everything you do in the community is advertised as such. Write blogs, post things on Twitter, post messages anywhere you can. You know, use Facebook, use any medium that you think hits the people that are possibly interested by what you're doing. Because these people, some of them will join your community. And there are statistics out there that all amount to the same thing. You may have millions of users, but you'll only have tens, maybe hundreds, thousands, if you're really lucky, of contributors in the community. And that's okay. Some communities are very active with 10 people. Actually, who knows how many people contribute to the OpenSSL code? OpenSSL. Who knows what OpenSSL is? OpenSSL is one of the most commonly used, probably used by everybody, crypto libraries on the planet. It's used everywhere, in SSH, in web servers, in commerce servers, everywhere. So who knows how many contributors? Exactly. It was one. Yeah, it was one who was doing this on his spare time. And somebody contributed a few years ago to the code and helped fix something. And then a few years after, it was realized that there was this huge bug in the code that was contributed and that nobody had seen it. But because everybody was just trusting the whole code and using it like that, somebody looked at it and said, oh, my, this is horrible. So when this was discovered a few years back now, there was a big effort, a big effort to actually create a business organization around OpenSSL to actually foster the development and grow artificially the community by people whose time is contributed by their employers. Okay, but some communities are extremely important to the world, but only have a few users, and that's okay. That's okay, right? But as long as you communicate about what you're doing, you're going to attract people potentially to your community because they might not know about it if you didn't contribute. Okay, another thing that's interesting is open source is a great way, I mentioned it, to attract people. So if you want to grow not just your outreach, but your team itself, if you're looking at hiring the best developers on the planet and you're doing open source, which is cool, make sure people know about it. Make sure that when you contribute on GitHub, it's listed as your company, because people will see that. Make sure that you encourage your employees to be listed as contributors and belonging to your company. Make sure that you tweet about it. If you do press releases, if you do job descriptions, put in your job descriptions that people will be encouraged on their working time to contribute to the projects they use, because that is extremely attractive. One of my customers, a UK bank, has their internal charter to be what they call a destination employer, whatever that means, for the best developers in UK on open source technology. And then they're telling us, how do we do that? tell the world they will contribute. Oh, okay. So really important. Make sure that it's known. It all amounts to this, right? Whatever you do is open source, make sure it's visible, always. You can only benefit from it. You will attract talent, you will attract users. And this is important because when you attract users, some people will want to contribute, some people will be users. As an example, if you're looking at an open source database, there's distributed databases, and we're not talking DLTs here, just real standard distributed databases. MongoDB, Cassandra, they're two open source databases. They behave completely differently from a development perspective. The CEO of MongoDB said, we don't want people to contribute to our code. We're not interested in having an active contribution community. We don't care. Actually, if you try contributing code, we're not going to even look at it. We develop our stuff. We publish it as open source. Now it's not considered open source anymore because of the SSPL. Yeah, I see a hand raised. But don't contribute. We just want people to see it as open source, to try it out, and then become paying customers. Cassandra, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. It's all developed by a community, and they expect and hope people will contribute to making it better. I have a question there.
Hello?
Yeah.
So just out of curiosity, of course, from a different perspective, why do you think Apple not using open source can still be successful?
So Apple is using open source. The core of macOS is FreeBSD. It's an open source operating system. It is using open source. It's lowering their development costs significantly. They didn't have to develop a kernel. And they can still say we're using open source. Actually, nowadays, they also have a lot of open source activity that they're doing. But macOS itself is not open source, and that sucks. It really sucks. That said, because it's based on a Unix kernel, not even a Linux, but a Unix kernel, it is attractive to developers. They find a convenient environment that they know. So it's popular for the developer community, despite the fact that the APIs are closed, the hardware is closed, and expensive. But they look good. They made their hardware available for free to universities at the beginning, to artists at the beginning. So they created a market by other aspects. Microsoft, look at how Microsoft is everywhere. And until a few years back, it was anything but open source, right? So there are other ways to become attractive, especially by throwing money at marketing activities and things like that. But open source, definitely an interesting way. So I was mentioning this top coder. By the way, this is a shameless plug to what we do at Wipro. It's a company we acquired, and they do crowdfunding for projects. So the idea here is you create a project. You say, for example, we need somebody to write a module for this application. Here are the specs. And the best code we find will be rewarded by $1,000, $500, whatever we want. So you create a project, and you crowdsource it, and you offer a reward. This can be used for open source projects, but proprietary as well. If you go to ios.topcoder.com and you have an Apple developer ID, you get into Apple projects. They're not all open source, but companies are using this for open source projects as well. The tricky part here is that while you're offering rewards, you're making your project known, so you're raising your visibility, but you're also telling people, we'll pay you for this. And the moment you stop paying, boom, the contributors drop, obviously. So you might use it to do a challenge every now and then to raise the visibility, but make sure it doesn't look too much like we're going to pay the developers forever, because the result in the end will be counterproductive. Okay, so it's a very interesting tool, but you have to make the right choice in terms of how you want to use it, especially in the open source world. That's my summary slide. Make sure you have an open source strategy. Why do you want to do open source? Is it because you want to drive adoption, because you want to have a community, because you want to grow trust by showing what you're doing, etc. During the hackathon, I will be there to help you with that. If you have a question, we don't know what license to use. We don't know if we should be open source. And I'm not a zealot, right? If you don't want to do open source, I'm not going to complain. I might a little bit, but not too much. But decide your strategy, choose your open source license. Make sure you know where you're going to put your code. I didn't talk too much about that, but things like GitHub or not. Are you going to have a foundation to own the source code, or are you going to own the source code? If you're using a foundation, are you going to create it from scratch? Don't. Or are you going to use another one like Eclipse or Apache or something like that? It's much simpler. Every time you can do something that's already there, use something already there, do it. You're going to save a lot of time and effort. That is really the important part. Everything you do about open source, it's open source. It's already in the open, right? So make an active effort of communicating about it, because when you do that, you multiply the impact of what you're doing with open source. And as I said, it's already open source. The stuff is out there. So don't sort of say, we can't tell the world we're using this because people will see our code. It's there. They will see your code. So communicate. Make an active plan of communicating about your open source activities. It's always beneficial, always, right? Okay. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we have time for questions. Thank you, Gilles. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, so at least 2-3 questions we can handle. Who does want the mic? Yeah, Bert. Of course you do.
And while we're doing the question, here is my... I didn't put my email on this. Anyway, you have my... You can find me with all this.
Okay.
LinkedIn, send me an invite. You'll have my email on my profile.
Okay,
thank you for this presentation. Can you say something about what this looks like for Ethereum?
For Ethereum?
Yeah.
Ethereum is an open source project, so you grab the code, use the code, make sure you follow the license if you're going to if you want to take a picture of that slide, make sure you follow the license if you're going to reuse the code somewhere.
Please repeat the question.
Is Ethereum licensed? I don't remember the license of Ethereum, but it is an open source license. If you go to the website ethereum.io, I think something like that, there is a clear. I just don't remember the terms of the license, but it is a known open source license. They didn't invent one for the purpose of this. Probably something like an Apache license. Because you can use Ethereum in the context of another proprietary project on top. So, but I would check it on their website.
Okay, who's next? Other questions? Lady in the back first. I'll come to you.
Yes, thank you. Hi. Can you say something about how to run your project? You mentioned a foundation could be a potentially good way. What other alternatives are there, and what would be your suggestion?
Well, the simplest thing is to just put your code on GitHub. But GitHub is more of a passive way of sharing your code. It's there, it's a repository. It's an easy tool because developers can actually download your project, use it, they can contribute back, they can make pull requests very easily. But it's just that. It's a tool for sharing your project and making a platform for joint development. The idea of having a foundation is to put the ownership of the code into a legal structure that guarantees some form of neutrality. So for example, Allianz, the big Austrian insurance company, last year they announced the publication of the source code of their whole insurance processing backbone, 6 million lines of code. And they did that because they want to show that they're transparent to their customers. They basically tell them, this is the stuff, you can use it by yourself, or you can buy it from us and we'll sell you support. But in order to guarantee to you that we're not going to cut that source of information, we're actually putting all of the code inside a foundation that we created, but it's jointly run, not just by us, but by other industry players, to guarantee that it's neutral. So it's an element of trust, creating a foundation, or putting it as an Apache Foundation project or an Eclipse Foundation project. It's basically saying, we're not going to stop this project while you use it because it's now owned by a foundation.
So one final question.
Thank you.
By the way, I'm going to be available outside for final
question in the room because the next session starts in 15 minutes.
So one issue with open source, you already obviously mentioned at the beginning that companies might be afraid that someone is going to steal their code. What would you say to a company that has a great solution, and it would make sense to make it open source because it applies to their character, but they are concerned not that someone steals their code, but that a other larger corporation, IBM, would, look at their code and see how they are doing things just slightly different from them, even with the GPL license,
Yep.
the most strict one. Okay, it forces them to republish everything they do with your code. But if they just look at it and then implement it in their own code.
So first of all, not everything has to be open source. I mean, if you talk to Richard Stallman, the founder of the Free Software Foundation, he will say everything has to be open source. But honestly, not everything has to be open. Actually, he would say everything has to be free software because he doesn't like the term open source. But anyway, not everything has to be open source. Typically, you would publish as open source things that you think other people that will benefit the rest of the community. Okay, so your proprietary algorithms, your proprietary IP that applies to your business logic and your business differentiator, you probably don't want to publish that. You could have that as a specific external module, like a decision module or I don't know what, that is not open source. In the example of Allianz, what they did is they published a backbone software, but just finishing that last question answer. So typically what Allianz did is they published a whole backbone and they're saying to their customers, you guys, you do like us. We all use the same backbone, but anything that is business logic that is only specific to you will be made available by you to your customers as a module that connects to the backbone. So you share the code that is obviously interesting for the common good, and you keep things that must be kept secret because specific algorithms for you. Internally. That said, the merit of publishing it as open source is to say to the other, this is our algorithm, this is why we make these decisions, you can trust those decisions are good. But that's a different choice, right? So some things probably don't need to be open source because they're too sensitive in terms of business logic and business differentiator. It's okay, just make sure that they can be seen as separate but connected modules so that you don't have to publish them. And if it's your code that you're publishing, right? Your own software, maybe with a very strict AGPL license that say anything you connect to it has to be open source. But because it's your code, when you're using it, you don't have to follow that license. It's your code. Okay? So the license applies to people who are using your code, not to you. Or you can make a dual license.
Thank you, Gilles. We have to cut it.